The cartoons of the 1980 seconds weren't all sugar-coated toy ads and Saturday morning fun. Some of them carried stories so intense, so shocking for kids at the time, that networks hacked them to pieces or yanked them all together. But what really happened behind those edits? And what got restored years later when fans demanded the real deal? Buckle up, because you're about to see the cartoons you thought you knew but never actually saw in full. Transformers, the movie. 1986. Few moments in animated history scarred children quite like this one. Picture it: Optimus Prime, the ultimate Saturday morning hero, mortally wounded in battle and fading away on screen. Parents flooded toy aisles and hotlines with complaints. The studio thought they were simply replacing one toy with another, but kids didn't see it as merchandise. They saw it as their hero dying. When the film first aired on television, entire segments were cut down. The brutality of the Decepticon ambush, the drawn-out passing of Optimus, even the darker tone of Unicron-consuming planets were softened. The idea was simple: make it less heartbreaking, more palatable. But the edits left the narrative gutted, missing the emotional weight that gave the story its legacy. Years later, fans demanded the original, and home releases finally restored the full cut. Watching it today, you see the raw intention of the animators, an unapologetic push to tell kids that stakes were real, that even icons could fall. It was bold, controversial, and unforgettable. The lesson? A watered-down version may have spared a few tears in the short run, but the restored version proved timeless. The movie that once caused outrage is now celebrated as the crown jewel of 80 seconds animation. It turned grief into myth, giving fans a story that still fuels nostalgia decades later. Thundercats 1989. On the surface, Thundercats looked like pure, toy-fueled adventure, cat warriors fighting cosmic villains with glowing swords. But networks quickly discovered that the show's darker edges made some executives nervous. Episodes featuring Mum-Ra's transformations, rituals, and intense fight sequences were trimmed down. International edits toned down entire battles, replacing dangerous energy blasts with flashes of light. For kids who saw only the butchered version, the show looked like a fun but oddly choppy adventure. Scenes jumped forward, tension dissolved, and the sense of danger disappeared. But when restored episodes began surfacing in DVD releases and later streaming, fans realized just how much atmosphere had been lost. The original cuts leaned into suspense, with dramatic pacing and higher stakes. Even Mum-Ra himself went from silly villain to truly menacing. The result was a striking difference. The edited episodes felt like fragments, while the restored ones felt like full-on epics. And here's the kicker. Those restored versions revealed how ambitious the series actually was, mixing swashbuckling action with sci-fi grandeur. The edits didn't just censor violence, they muted the creativity. Looking back now, Thundercats stands as a perfect case of how networks underestimated kids. Audiences were ready for more intensity than executives allowed. The restored versions gave fans the series they always remembered in their hearts, but never got to see on screen. G.I. Joe, the movie 1987. If Transformers the movie shook kids, G.I. Joe nearly doubled down. The script originally had Duke, arguably the franchise's heart and soul, killed in battle. The creators wanted shock value, to show that even America's most heroic soldier wasn't untouchable. But studio executives, still reeling from the backlash over Optimus Prime's death, pulled the brakes hard. Instead of letting Duke's story end with tragedy, they rushed in last-minute edits. A single line of dialogue was dubbed over late in production, announcing that Duke had fallen into a coma and would recover. No hospital. Scenes, no aftermath, just a quick patch job to avoid breaking young hearts. It was clumsy, and audiences noticed. The pacing made no sense, and the impact of the fight was erased. What's fascinating is that the restored version, released much later, showed the original darker vision. It wasn't just about selling toys, it was about raising the stakes in a world where battles had consequences. The restored version gave weight to Cobra's menace, showing they weren't cartoonish buffoons, but dangerous enemies. That shift in tone mattered. It was the difference between a disposable toy commercial and a story that made fans feel invested. Today, fans look back on the Coma edit as one of the clumsiest cover-ups in animation history. The restored version might not have been what kids saw in 1987, but it's the one that finally lets the story breathe. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe 1983-1985. He-Man was a juggernaut of 80 seconds animation, muscle-bound heroes, sorcery, and a toy line that dominated toy shelves. But behind the booming catchphrases, the show faced constant pushback from watchdog groups and nervous networks. The issue? Violence and sorcery. Episodes with sword fights, dark magic, or even too much scary imagery were often trimmed. Skeletor's more menacing moments were toned down, his dialogue softened, and magical rituals were either shortened or completely snipped out. The edits left some episodes awkwardly stitched, where He-Man's victories looked like they came out of nowhere. When restored versions began surfacing decades later, it was clear just how much bite the series originally had. Skeletor wasn't just comic relief, he was a ruthless schemer with real menace. The restored episodes showed longer fight choreography, moments of peril that actually made kids worry, and dramatic tension that gave He-Man's triumphs weight. Here's the irony. The edits were supposed to protect kids, but they stripped away the very drama that made the stories work. He-Man, without tension, was just a muscle guy with a sword. Restored He-Man was an epic about good versus evil, with real risks and payoffs. Today, the restored cuts give fans a window into what the creators intended all along, a fantasy saga with grit hiding underneath the bright colors. It's proof that even toy-driven shows were capable of ambitious storytelling. Robotech 1985. Robotech is the strangest case in this lineup because it wasn't one show, it was three. American producers stitched together three separate Japanese series, Macross, Southern Cross, and Mospeada, and reworked them into a single sprawling sci-fi saga. The idea was clever, but the edits changed everything. The original Japanese versions were loaded with heavy themes, love triangles, character deaths, and the trauma of war. When brought to U.S. audiences, entire storylines were softened. References to culture, alcohol, and romance were stripped away, while many intense death scenes were either cut or disguised. What you saw on American TV was a cleaner, safer patchwork designed to sell toys, not to challenge kids. But decades later, fans who discovered the original Japanese versions realized just how much had been lost. The restored cuts, whether through fan projects or official releases, revealed a completely different tone, one that leaned into tragedy, character complexity, and consequences. Suddenly, the show wasn't just about giant robots fighting aliens. It was about relationships, sacrifices, and what war does to people. This split made Robotech legendary in its own right. Kids who grew up with the butchered American version remembered the excitement, but those who dug into the originals found a depth rarely seen in 80 seconds animation. Restored Robotech isn't just a cartoon, it's a sci-fi opera that treated its audience with rare seriousness. Voltron, Defender of the Universe, 1984. Voltron looked like pure Saturday morning fun, 5 robot lions combining into one towering warrior. But what American kids got in the 80 seconds was not the full picture. The original Japanese series, Beast King Go Lion, was far darker. Characters died, villains were ruthless. Even the tone of the battles carried a sense of looming tragedy. When it crossed over to American syndication, censors got busy. Scenes of destruction were trimmed. Deaths were reworked into vague disappearances. Entire story arcs that had weight and sorrow were scrubbed into sanitized adventures where heroes always pulled through at the last second. Even the villain's cruelty was dulled down, turning once terrifying threats into something closer to comic book caricatures. The result? The American audience adored Voltron, but what they saw was a shadow of the original. Kids cheered the flashy battles, but they never felt the emotional gravity of pilots facing permanent loss. It wasn't until restored and subtitled versions of Go Lion surfaced years later that fans realized the story had been gutted. What had been sold as lighthearted fun was originally a brutal saga of survival, with themes far heavier than parents or networks imagined kids could handle. The irony is that those darker cuts gave Voltron staying power. Fans today celebrate the restored editions as the true, raw story, while still loving the nostalgia of the butchered TV version. Voltron lives in two forms, one as a colorful toy commercial and the other as a tragic space opera that was almost hidden forever. The Real Ghostbusters 1986-1991. Here's a case where the problem wasn't toys or fights, it was fear. The Real Ghostbusters took the wildly successful Ghostbusters film and adapted it for kids, but some of the episodes leaned far closer to horror than lighthearted comedy. Monsters with unsettling designs, episodes with eerie pacing, and storylines featuring dream manipulation or possession quickly raised alarms. Censors trimmed entire sequences. Monsters that were designed to terrify were softened in edits. Demonic imagery and darker dreamscapes were either toned down or skipped altogether. In some cases, episodes were rewritten before they even aired, removing layers of storytelling that might have pushed the boundaries of Saturday morning TV. Fans who grew up with the series never noticed the missing pieces. They just remembered the laughs, the ghosts, and the catchy theme tune. But when restored versions surfaced decades later, the difference was striking. Suddenly, the show wasn't just funny. It was genuinely creepy in places. The ghosts carried menace. The stakes felt real, and the series revealed itself as a bold attempt to balance horror with humor. The edits, meant to protect kids, robbed the show of part of its unique identity. Restored, The Real Ghostbusters becomes more than a spin-off. It's a daring experiment in bringing the spirit of horror to animation. Mighty Orbots, 1984. Mighty Orbots is one of the strangest casualties of the 1980 seconds. At first glance, it was just another robot team show, colorful and upbeat, with heroes combining their powers to stop intergalactic threats. But behind the scenes, it faced battles that no edits could fix. Tonka, the company behind GoBots, accused the show of being too similar to their toy line. Legal trouble piled up, and instead of letting the show find its audience, networks pulled the plug after a single season. Even the episodes that did air weren't safe. Networks trimmed action scenes and tightened pacing, afraid of complaints about intensity or violence. What fans were left with was a fragmented glimpse of what could have been. The butchered versions stripped away the tension and excitement, leaving episodes that felt rushed, but in restored releases, Mighty Orbots shines as a visually inventive, energetic series that stood apart from both Transformers and GoBots. The animation was fluid, the characters quirky, and the designs vibrant. The tragedy of Mighty Orbots is that its edits and early cancellation made it vanish almost instantly. Restored episodes show what potential it had to be a cult classic. Instead, it's remembered as one of the 80 seconds great what-ifs. A show butchered not just by censors, but by lawsuits and missed opportunities. Rainbow Brite, 1984, 1986. Rainbow Brite might look like the softest entry on this list, a pastel explosion designed to sell dolls and light up accessories. But buried beneath the sparkles, some episodes carried darker undertones that made executives squirm. The main villains weren't just mischievous. They plotted to plunge entire worlds into darkness. Early drafts and original cuts featured imagery of characters facing real peril, with shadows closing in and entire lands swallowed by voids. When these episodes aired in syndication, much of that menace was stripped away. Entire sequences of Rainbow and her friends in danger were trimmed or softened, leaving behind jumpy edits that felt oddly incomplete. Villains lost their menace, and climaxes wrapped up too neatly. It was a case of networks underestimating kids' ability to handle tension. Restored versions show the full weight of the show's ambition. Instead of shallow Rainbow saves the day stories, they reveal a series that leaned into cosmic stakes. Villains like Murky and Lurky became more than bumbling comic relief. They felt like genuine threats. The restored Rainbow Brite reveals a simple truth. Even the brightest, most colorful shows had depth when left intact. Stripped down, it was just candy-colored fluff. Restored, it was a fantasy adventure with a surprising edge. Sectaurs, Warriors of Symbion, 1985. This show was marketed as Bug Warriors with Attitude, but what aired on TV was a toned-down version of something far more bizarre. The original concept leaned heavily into insect-inspired body horror, characters riding giant creepy crawlers, transformations that looked uncomfortably grotesque, and battles where insect physiology was front and center. Networks didn't like it. Complaints poured in from parents who thought the show was too intense, too gross, too unsettling for kids. The result was a heavily butchered run. In some regions, entire episodes were pulled or never aired. In others, action sequences were cut short, leaving behind disjointed stories where threats seemed to vanish mid-scene. The restored episodes show just how wild the creators went. Instead of tame toy battles, you get a full-on sci-fi horror hybrid where humans and insects merged in weird, unsettling ways. The ambition was off the charts, even if the execution rattled some audiences. What's left today is a cult curiosity. The censored version is a confusing memory of half-told stories. The restored version is bold, experimental, and unforgettable, proof that the 80 seconds animation boom sometimes went places kids' TV wasn't ready for. Silverhawks, 1986. Silverhawks was essentially Thundercats in space, but with a shinier, metallic edge. Half-human, half-cybernetic heroes battled monstrous space villains, and the visual style leaned hard into both sci-fi spectacle and grotesque character design. That grotesque part? It didn't fly with censors. Scenes featuring the villain Mon Star's transformations were often shortened. His sinister design, combined with violent confrontations, made networks nervous. Action sequences were softened, with energy blasts turned into vague flashes of light and impacts trimmed down. But here's the twist. The restored versions show a completely different energy. Silverhawks wasn't just flashy space adventure, it was eerie, stylish, and at times genuinely intense. The villains carried menace, the battles had weight, and the tone was far darker than what most kids ever saw. As with Thundercats, the edits robbed the series of its strongest moments. Restored, it becomes clear that Silverhawks was meant to balance spectacle with dread, creating a unique mix that pushed the boundaries of what 80 seconds kids' cartoons could be. Instead, audiences got a watered-down version that barely hinted at its potential. Bionic Six, 1989. Bionic Six was ambitious, an action-packed show about a blended family turned into superheroes through advanced technology. Each member had unique powers, and the show leaned into themes of teamwork and sacrifice. But the darker edge of those powers? Networks cut it. Episodes that featured painful transformations, dangerous body modifications, or too much emphasis on the consequences of becoming part machine were heavily edited. In some markets, entire episodes never aired, leaving fans with gaps in the story. The restored versions make the show far more compelling. Instead of lighthearted gadget play, you get a series that wasn't afraid to explore identity, technology, and what it means to give up part of yourself to save the world. Characters felt richer, villains carried more menace, and the stakes were clear. What's left is a show remembered fondly but underappreciated. Restored Bionic Six proves that beneath the bright animation, it carried depth far beyond its toy-selling mission. The edits buried its ambition, but fans who rediscovered the uncut episodes realized just how ahead of its time it really was. The 80 seconds gave us cartoons that shaped a generation, but many of them reached us sliced, softened, and stripped of their edge. Only decades later did fans discover the hidden versions, the ones networks didn't think we could handle. And here's the question. Were those edits protecting kids or robbing them of unforgettable stories? Drop your thoughts below, hit like if you grew up on these shows, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history.